Scientific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro.
Well, Tim, I got my first vaccine last week, thanks to the healthcare workers and volunteers at the Fountain Valley Medical Center, which is in Orange County. I got the Moderna vaccine, and it went very smoothly. I was in and out of there in half an hour or so, and thanks to everyone. A shout out for Fountain Valley Medical Center. They did a great job.
And I got my vaccine on Friday at UC Davis here in Sacramento, and I'm very grateful to them for opening up eligibility to 16 plus before the April 15th date that it was originally supposed to be. I was dreading, there was going to take weeks and weeks to be able to get it once everybody was on all at once, but I got an appointment, was able to get in within a few days. It was very well organized. It was kind of a long line that I saw when I walked up, stretching around the building, but it went through very fast. They were very efficient. I was in and out of there, I'd say in a little over 45 minutes. So, and looking forward to getting shot number 2 in a few weeks.
Well, I know there's concern about a fourth surge, and you're seeing that in the Midwest. At least here in Los Angeles County, we're not really seeing that. So I hope it remains low, and we're going to, dodge that fourth surge, especially now that so many people are getting vaccinated. I know in Sacramento and the Central Valley where you are, you're still in the red tier, isn't that right?
Yeah, I looked the other day. Our numbers are still, I believe it was 9% positivity, and I didn't look at the trend to see if that had ticked up a little bit, but I know we need to be under, I think it's 6% to go into the orange tier. So it looks like Sacramento, may be a bit of a ways off before we go into the next tier. But the other measurements, the health equity and I forget what the third measurement is, we were in good shape on both of those fronts. So yeah, we're definitely higher than the rest of the state.
Well, that's good news. So, and it's getting lower because I'm hoping that California doesn't have to. We can dodge this fourth surge, and we can all get back to normal and have a wonderful 4th of July, as the president said.
The party's at my house. Everybody's invited.
So this week's podcast is from a webinar we held earlier this month on Charles Kesler's new book, Crisis of the Two Constitutions. So what does that mean, two constitutions? It's a matter of judicial philosophy. One approach is what liberals are calling the living constitution, which means that our constitution should evolve with the changing times. The other interpretation, which conservatives subscribe to and which Charles Kesler supports, is a constitution that sticks to the original meaning of the founding fathers. One of the biggest champions of this idea, I remember, is the late Justice Antonin Scalia, who had a great quote. He said, "The only good constitution is a dead constitution." So as you can see, as readers know or listeners know, the conflict between, quote, the dead and the living constitution is at the heart of many of the cases in the courts today, and of course, a lot of the policy issues that we're facing.
That's right. You're seeing it with President Biden last week created his anticipated a commission to studying the Supreme Court of the United States. And that was something that, hardcore progressives demanded. They want to pack the court. They didn't like what happened over the last 4 years where President Trump actually filled all the vacancies on the Supreme Court. Well, the lesson from that is maybe Barack Obama shouldn't have left so many vacancies on the court. Maybe he should have filled them. You're even seeing there's a mobile billboard driving around Washington calling on Justice Breyer to resign, quote, so President Biden can appoint a Black woman to the Supreme Court, which he has promised to do with his first vacancies. And one of the issues why Breyer is getting heat is that he's actually come out publicly not in favor of court packing, which is what many on the left want this commission to conclude. I think the issue with this commission, and they're calling it bipartisan, and I'm sure they'll have some quote unquote conservative legal scholar who will say, yes, we should pack the courts. Probably someone none of us have ever heard of before. But the issue will be, is this one of those throwaway things? Often people on the right or the left will fight over the platform. Well, the platform doesn't really mean anything, so you can put whatever you want in there, and it's the president's vision that governs the nation. Well, after this commission does its work, is President Biden going to file this report away in a drawer some way and say, thank you very much, we had our commission and looked into it? Or is he actually going to take some sort of action to try and pack the court? And I think it remains to be seen.
Well, that's interesting because Biden did really run as a moderate. So whether he did create this commission, which I believe he promised creating commission back during the campaign, whether he's doing this just to appease the far left in his party, or whether he might actually execute. And as you know, we're all pretty surprised about this huge infrastructure plan, which is not really an infrastructure plan, but a lot of social engineering, a lot of Green New Deal projects. So he's really kind of gone out and moved to the left, lurched to the left on a lot of the policy issues. This issue with the two constitutions, we're really seeing that in so many other areas. Biden had just put out some executive orders on gun restrictions. Again, that's a Second Amendment issue. I believe some states are also challenging that. There's also the issue of H.R. 1, which federalizes elections. Elections are conducted under state laws. So if this passes, it will supersede state law and federalize voting. And so that's also being constitutionally challenged.
It's ironic because it's the opposite of what's going on in Georgia, where you see people who are against that, the Georgia state voting law, are criticizing, well, you're taking away local control from local election officials to do, what they think is best for their community. Well, a lot of those same people support H.R. 1 at the federal level, which would take away a lot of state and local election restrictions. And I think all of this clash of the two constitutions, I think it all comes down to many liberals and many in the Biden administration are intent on seizing this moment to enact generations of long sought policy changes, either through executive order or through legal action or through whatever way possible they can get it through both houses of Congress. And, it's a fight, whatever happens here in the next 2 years, as inevitably party control will pass back and forth between the two parties. This crisis of two constitutions is really going to drive the debate for years to come, I think. And it has been for the past several decades.
So we brought PRI Senior Fellow and Powerline blogger Steve Hayward to interview Charles Kesler. As you know, Professor Kesler is one of the preeminent conservative intellectuals in our day. He's the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. But we think his two greatest achievements, being the husband of our president, Sally Pipes, and the other great achievement is that he named our podcast Next Round. So thank you for listening. Thanks for listening.
So I want to welcome everybody to another in PRI's periodic webinar series. Today, we are joined by Charles Kesler, who I always have to look up exactly the title, the Dangler Dykema Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College, editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and author most recently of, and what we'll talk about principally today, is Crisis of the Two Constitutions, The Rise, Decline, and Recovery of American Greatness. So Charles, welcome. I think what I want to do first, getting started, is do what I call the Brian Lamb questions from Book TV, right? Which is what's in this book. I mean, it's not a formal treatise that you have to start and go all the way to the end of all 418 pages. It's a collection of essays, some of them dating back a while, some of them brand new and more recent. So you take it from there and describe what you put together.
Right. All right. Well, first of all, thanks for putting up with me, Steve. I appreciate your hosting this webinar, and my thanks to PRI and to Laura Dannerbeck and Sally Pipes, whom I know personally, who is the president of PRI. Thanks to her as well for the invitation, and to Rowena Itchon. So it's great to be here. And yeah, so this book began as a collection of essays And then I sort of, under the twin pressure of the Trump years and the COVID year, when I was working on it, at least partly working on it, I sort of added a few chapters to it and revised everything to make it fresh. I mean, people who read some of these essays 5 years ago will recognize them still, or 10 years ago. But I think they've all been given a kind of reinterpretation in the light of the Trump experience and the Obama years, and where we sort of have now find ourselves in American politics. And in that sense, it's a collection, but with a unified point of view and a unified set of questions, which is really to figure out why we're in this unpleasant and unhappy situation politically.
Well, I'm going to come to your through line that's contained in the main title, but the point is, for readers, is you can pick and choose what essays you want to read. You're not committing to reading, a dense. You're not committed to reading John Rawls' Theory of Justice, which everybody regrets by the time they get to page 3. Right. So, right. So if you're interested in Trump,
but in fact, John Rawls does you the favor of telling you in the beginning which are the important parts you have to read in his introduction to the Theory of Justice. I do not tell you that. You have complete liberty to skip around in this book and construct your own meaning from the fragments that I give you. So it isn't necessarily meant to be read from start to finish.
Right. I bring that up to reassure readers who sometimes are intimidated by what look to be difficult books or theoretical books and so forth. So yeah, if you're just interested in the Trump business, you turn to the last third, and if you're interested in more background on the American founding, that's in the first third. I think you'd say. All right, let's turn to the title, the crisis of the two constitutions. What are the two constitutions that you are referring to here in the title?
So the crisis really is that you oughtn't to have two constitutions in one country. That's the beginning, because then you have a kind of crisis of the regime. Which one is really constituting your politics, your political life, and indeed your whole social outlook as a country? And so the thesis of this book is that America is unfortunately in a situation where we are increasingly torn between two constitutions. There's the original Constitution, the one that the founders wrote and that we have amended as a country, 27 times since then. And that one is the what I call the Founders' Constitution. It's the Constitution of Natural Rights. It includes the Declaration of Independence as a kind of philosophical beginning, but it's really the Constitution that also embraces you might say, traditional American character. What kind of a people were the Americans meant to be by the founders and their perpetuators? And then the second Constitution is the Liberals' Constitution, the Progressives' Constitution, which began 100 years ago and is still very much alive. And they like to call it sometimes the living Constitution. And I always like that phrase because it's very revealing. The living Constitution means, from their point of view, that the other one is dead, or at least that it's on life support, and that its only chance for life is to have transfusions from the living Constitution into the dead one or the dying one, and that the whole game is really not to, fuse the two of them or have the two converge, but really to have the Founders' Constitution supplanted by the Progressives' Constitution. And when that happens, you get basically a new country. You get a refounding, you get a new revolution, as it were, a new American revolution, and a kind of new country. And that's where, unfortunately, we are, I think, heading in our politics.
Yeah. So when I saw the two constitutions in the title, I got to thinking of another book out recently that I think you know pretty well, and it's Chris Caldwell's book on the age of entitlement. in which he makes the argument that the civil rights revolution has replaced the old Constitution, has distorted our Constitution, distorted our notion of rights. Are you, I guess the question I want to ask you is, how congruent are you with Caldwell's thesis? I mean, or I'm not quite sure how to put the question mark on this. How are you similar and how are you different from his account?
Well, I admire that book a great deal and like it, and have assigned it even to students. And The Age of Entitlement is a very good book that, from my point of view at least, begins in medias res. It begins in the middle of the story of the coming of liberalism to American politics. So it effectively begins in the 1960s. There are a few flashbacks to the 50s and 40s, but basically the through story begins with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And its, you could say, perversion as interpreted and applied as working itself out in American politics in a way that effectively, I always like the phrase that Angelo Codevilla came up with in the pages of CRB at one point. He called the Civil Rights Act the little law that ate the Constitution. And there's a lot of truth to that. And that's, in a way, the thesis of Chris's book. But I would say I would add to Chris's analysis, you might say, the first two waves of liberalism. And in order to see where you get the energy and the perverse interpretive zeal that turns what appears to be a colorblind law in the Civil Rights Act into an engine of reverse discrimination throughout American politics.
Right. Well, that was going to be my next question, which is in your previous book about Obama, I Am the Change from 2012, right. You wrote about what you call the three waves of liberalism. And what you just said, to recapitulate it, is Caldwell's book looks at the key events of what we might call the third wave. So go back a little bit and briefly tell our listeners and viewers what are the three waves of liberalism, and are we right now under President Biden seeing a new fourth wave or just a continuation of the third wave?
I'll take the second part of the question first. I think under Biden we're seeing a continuation and of the Obama wave. And the Obama wave was in its own way a continuation and radicalization in some ways of the third wave, the 1960s wave. But look, you, Steve, know a lot about the history of American politics and American conservatism. So I'm not telling you anything new. But the way I characterize it is as follows. So we got the second Constitution, the living Constitution, out of the progressive era. And the 1912 election was sort of the breakthrough, where Woodrow Wilson was able to divide, the two Republican candidates, Taft and the progressive TR, split the Republican vote. And that was the only way, really, that Woodrow Wilson managed to make it into the presidency. But make it he did. And he came with a theory. He was really the first president since the founding, I suppose, who had a fully worked out theory of the presidential office and indeed of the whole government of the United States. And his theory was the living Constitution theory. The argument was the old Constitution was an 18th century document. And as you would not, we don't normally look back to 18th century dentistry for our standards of dental science. And his argument was there's no reason, and why should we look back to 18th century political science and to its great product, the Constitution, for what we need in our politics? We need to move beyond all that and to acknowledge new discoveries about the nature of man and the evolutionary character of everything, the historically changeable, progressive character of everything. I mean, progressives, in this case, often in politics, words are used for deceptive purposes, but in this case, progressives really do believe in progress, and they believe in the inevitability of progress. So it's a very strong case for progress, not just in scientific and technological areas, but in moral and political and religious areas as well. So we got a new constitution out of that understanding. In the second wave, basically the 1930s, the era of the Great Depression and the New Deal, we get a new Bill of Rights to go with the new Constitution. And this new Bill of Rights is what FDR famously calls the Second Bill of Rights, which, although it was never formally attached to the Constitution, the point was it was attached to the living Constitution. It was informally attached. And we get from that all of the, or most of the welfare rights that have been so central to American politics ever since the 1930s. So the right to health care, one of Sally Pipe's favorite rights, I jest, the right to a job, the right to unemployment insurance, the right to an education, all of these welfare rights or socioeconomic rights come from that second wave of American politics. And we've been living with them ever since. And then we have a third wave in the 1960s, which is a little bit harder to describe because it's more fratricidal and more self-contradictory. It's both Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society on the one hand, but also the new left and the anti-Vietnam War left on the extreme left hand. to adopt Ronald Reagan's old joke about his right hand didn't know what the far right hand was doing. So in the 1960s, the left hand of the Democratic Party didn't know what the far left hand of the Democratic Party was doing. But in effect, from the 60s, you get a third Bill of Rights. And the third Bill of Rights is a set of rights centered around the right to your own culture, the right to your own identity, the right to your own values, the right to your own moral standards. And that has worked itself out into identity politics today. And the current administration, the Biden administration, is very keen on identity politics, but also very keen on, the Green New Deal, and the infrastructure spending galore, very little for actual infrastructure. But in a way, it's pushing the first, the second, and the third waves of liberalism all at once in a very, energetic form of liberal advance.
Well, I want to ask you a bit about your distinction, which I think is quite important, between normal politics and regime politics. But before going into that, and maybe it contains the answer to this question, is can there be a fourth wave? Is there anywhere for leftism to go from where it is right now? Or, and I don't want to get too far off in the weeds here, or is the fact that there's no longer a coherent end of history in sight, meaning it's just an endless series of more and more equity and equality and so forth?
Yeah, it's. You could say, in a way, what you're hinting at here is that, from a certain point of view, the '60s went off the rails. All the arguments beforehand were about progress. About a sort of rational, scientific advance into the future, inevitable, egalitarian, all of those things, but comprehensible and sort of scientific in a way. But beginning in the 60s, with the discovery of values and of the right to your own lifestyle, the scientific or rational part of liberalism began to fall apart. And what you're left with is really a liberalism based upon willpower, upon assertiveness, on radicalism itself. It's really more about will to power than it is now about will to truth, or will to science, or will to any kind of end of history. There is no end to history, so history is just the ugly struggle for power among groups, and those groups are predominantly, racial, sexual groups founded in some sort of personal will to power, against white supremacy, and the discovery in our contemporary politics of the systemic quality of the sins of America, the systemic racism, systemic capitalism, systemic sexism, and so forth, really show you that liberalism today is not about changing America, which they regard increasingly, it seems, as irredeemable. You really can't change it. All you can do is rule it in the interest of your part of the population. Your group has to predominate over the groups that used to predominate in our politics. That's the kind of ugly place we're at, I think.
This is where I want to draw into the distinction you raised early on about normal politics versus regime politics. Normal politics is, should the top marginal income tax rate be 28% or 31%? And, those are serious economic arguments, but they're not fundamentally about the nature and character of the social order or the constitutional order, or, whether spending should go up 5% or 10% and so forth. I think the way you see this most clearly, and you've already hinted at it in the different and changing nature of our individual rights, is quite, you can see this actually as early as Lyndon Johnson's famous Howard University speech about, it's not enough to have everybody equal at the starting line if they've been hobbled. Okay, that's a comprehensible idea. But now his successors, I think, are more openly and directly saying equality, equal rights are not enough. Equity must now be the touchstone for everything that we do. And of course, equity and equality are different things in their mind, right? It's radical redistributionism, grading people by hierarchies, as you've already suggested. And so I think, of course, you finished the book some months ago in your new introduction to it, but it seems to me since the ink dried on the book, when you suggest that we may be entering into a regime crisis, it seems to me now you'd want to say we are in that regime crisis. So say a little bit more about, where the switches flip and the distinction between, can we get back to normal politics? I guess I'll put it that way.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I wrote the book with at least some hope that the American people could rediscover, the better angels of their nature. And there's some evidence that there is hope. I mean, if you look at what happened in California in the last election, it was, of course, an overwhelming victory for Joe Biden. He got 60-some% of the vote. It was no Republicans won any statewide office as usual out here. It was a very democratic, very liberal electorate. And yet the same people who voted so overwhelmingly for Biden and so, so minimally for Donald Trump were the same voters who said, no, we will not agree to the repeal of Prop 209. We will not agree to split the tax rolls under Prop 13 and enact a huge business tax increase. Despite the fact that there's, Joe Biden never saw a tax increase, it seems he didn't like. So even the liberal voters of California seem to be capable of drawing a line somewhere and saying, okay, up to this point, fine, but we don't really want to make discrimination on the basis of race legal and respectable in California. We don't want to make hiring on the basis of race legal and respectable in California. We can see that that's going to lead us into renewed and embittered controversy. So maybe there is enough common ground left for left and right, so to speak, to come back together. But you have to say that the trends are not good. The overall trends are not good. And the rapidity of the advance of liberalism or progressivism, I think, is shocking. I mean, as Chris Caldwell said, I think in the pages of National Review at some point, transgender rights went from being a joke to being public policy in about 3 months, and the pace of that advance, the breakneck pace of it, no time to absorb it, much less to oppose it, seems to be continuing, and the left seems to favor that sort of attack forward strategy.
Yeah, right. It's now become another off-limits subject that you cannot discuss or offer any criticism about, right? We saw Ryan Anderson's book banned by Amazon. It's
real cancellation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then we've seen the events this week of Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game from Atlanta. Because why? Because they believe some attacks on the voting rights law. Well, we can save that for some other time. It's all pretty ridiculous. You raise
Steve. I have a recommendation though. I'd like to hear your opinion of this. Why don't we just divide sports teams into different leagues? We should have a red league and a blue league. We should have red states should have their baseball league. Blue states should have theirs, and let them play against each other and really hate each other and take out their aggressions on each other. You'd probably get better baseball, and you'd certainly get a more engaged fan base.
Yeah, that would I think that would restore a team loyalty the way it used to be before the era of free agency disrupted teams every year, right? I mean, back in those old days of right, the Dodgers and the Giants, when there's Brooklyn and New York, and they throw tomatoes at each other, anyway, right? Yeah,
you'd have a real political sense of what you're standing for,
right?
When you're cheering for your team.
Yeah, I like it. We'll have to work with that. Back to a more sober prospect. You raised 5 possibilities. I thought we'll talk about these very briefly. One of them is based on the fact that we've been a 50-50 nation essentially for almost 30 years now. We're the second time in 20 years we have a 50-50 Senate. The parties have been going back and forth, trading control of Congress. And so prospect number 1 is, are we ever going to break out of this? Is someone going to win? I don't know. Well, I'll just stop there and say, do you think there's any prospect that one side or the other is actually going to achieve a durable majority that can govern on a democratic basis instead of just a will to power?
Yeah. It doesn't look like it. I mean, of course, you can't rule it out because nothing is inevitable either way in politics. But, since 1968, this has been the pattern in American politics. There hasn't been a national majority party. All political victories have been fairly narrow and fairly brief. And so we tend to alternate control of the presidency between the two parties, and we tend to deny either party control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency at the same time for very long. What's happened, Trump's loss and now Biden's win, even bringing the Senate in with him, temporarily the Democrats do now have control of the 3 elective branches. But probably you'd have to predict that in 2022, they'll lose it. That's the pattern. 2 years, 4 years at most. And typically only in the first 2 years can you get anything legislatively done. So that seems to be the pattern we're in. Now, the long shot at winning could be, of course, Trump was a wild card. You could have another situation of a wild card or where there's a real national crisis that might upset the boundaries, the normal boundaries of the two parties. That's possible. The thing that I worry about long term is the effect of higher education. Younger people are more and more liberal. The longer they're in higher education, the more liberal they are, and that is a pattern that unfortunately has. Bill Buckley was skewering this pattern in his first book in 1951. It's been around a long time. It's been around 75 years almost. And we have not found a way to break the progressive control of the universities, and now even the high schools and the grade schools, such that if we keep this up, it seems like we are educating. We are producing suicide by higher education, essentially, in American politics.
Yeah. It's, I used to think, I guess naively now in retrospect, that, well, if craziness is confined to college campuses, that's bad, but at least it's confined somewhere. And of course, what we've seen, this is now broken out from the college campuses quite dramatically, quite rapidly into corporate America, into all the media. Hollywood was already a lost cause, and that, right. So it's no longer just the English department that's insane. It's just about every HR department in a major corporation is now functionally insane too.
And the C-suites too.
Yes.
And Major League Baseball and all major sports, as you were saying. I mean, it really is quite different now from the 60s. In a way, we're locked into a kind of repetition compulsion, and we're reliving the 60s all the time. We can't get out of that set of issues. But except that things are worse now, because in the 60s, the Fortune 500 was not on the side of the radicals. And and even though universities were on the side of the radicals, they weren't as solidly on the side of the radicals as they are now. And of course, sports had nothing to do with radical politics back in those days, with the exception of the Olympics, where you did begin to see the trend set that has continued and accelerated.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned three other possibilities. One is maybe we might have a return to federalism. And it seems that, we'll see if some states have put up some resistance on the COVID business, Florida and Texas in particular, a couple of others. And maybe we'll see more of that. And we've seen several states embrace school choice since the teachers' unions are so intransigent about reopening public schools. But given the will to power of the progressive left that depends on centralization, it seems like the prospects for that are somewhat limited.
Yes, very limited. You could see, a rational sort of compromise might be, let's go back to, 1990 or 2000 or something. But it's impossible, I think, for the left to do that, because their reason for existence now is the creation of new rights, programmatic rights, which only the federal government ultimately can vindicate with programs. You need new departments, you need new agencies to vindicate the rights of the transgendered, and you need new forms of law and causes of action so that they can vindicate their rights in the courts as well. None of that can be rolled back. You can't roll back government without rolling back the rights that government now is in the job of protecting. And there's no way, the liberal mind would explode at the notion that we're going to subtract some of these new rights from the American consensus.
Yeah. Another prospect you raise is one of the oldest ones, which is secession. A lot of talk about this these days. There is quite a lot of sorting going out. As I always like to say, Idaho is becoming more like Idaho and Vermont is becoming more like Vermont. Why not split them up? And formally become two countries somehow. And so aside from some of the very serious practical problems, like how will you apportion the national debt between the two different parts, and also the problem of, you've got, like in California, for example, you've got a lot of very red-leaning places in the interior of the state, with the blue coast where more people live and dominate the politics of the state. It's not so easy, A, to see how that would happen or be done, and B, once again, like federalism, would the progressive left sit still for it? Yes.
Well, of course, it's an important question. Who gets the ICBMs?
Right. Yeah.
There might be an advantage to the red states in the Midwest, who've got them all. But still, yes, it's hard to see how you could how secession could work, and it would be very messy, you'd have to say, at the least, or at the best, and it's, what would it be like if a process of secession were started? How do you stop it? How do you control it? How do you moderate it? It's very difficult to see how it would work. In some ways, you could see dividing the country between the big cities, the big liberal cities, and everywhere else. You could have maybe city states, and maybe that's perhaps how a secession could work, in which, like, Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York and Chicago and so forth essentially leave their states behind, leave the United States behind. But we're obviously talking a very radical process that could unleash, lots of violence rather than saving us from lots of violence.
Yeah, well, that brings, of course, to the last prospect, which is an actual civil war. We tend to think of our Civil War as this odd anomaly, and it is in a certain superficial way, that you had uniformed armies in the field with geographical bases, which is a little different from a lot of civil wars, which are more guerrilla actions. And it's hard to replicate that unless it's the cities against the country, literally. But you do mention that, there could be some kind of political crisis, like a Supreme Court decision settling an election that people didn't accept, or various other kinds of eruptions of the kind that has the left all excited, like the events of the Capitol on January 6th. I'll come back to that in a bit. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of talk about this, but I have a hard time seeing how that works out, either practically or theoretically.
Yeah, we're in sort of a cold civil war right now, to use this term that lots of people, including Angelo Codevilla, have invested in. But we don't want it to turn into a hot civil war, that is, a shooting civil war. But the fact is, you could easily see how any number of crises could set off a violent or potentially violent reaction. A disputed presidential election, for example. Well, we just had one. It resulted in, the riot on January the 6th on Capitol Hill. But because none of the Republican-controlled states went along, basically, with the Trump campaign's effort to impeach the election, so to speak, and to have it in some way or another overturned, the danger would have been, and exactly what Madison might have foreseen as the danger point would be, if you get whole states which back a challenge to the Electoral College result or to the popular vote result. That would begin to give you the numbers and the political depth that could actually trigger a real political crisis. But you could easily imagine, and what if the Supreme Court, strikes down Roe v. Wade someday? Or what if the Supreme Court essentially strikes down the Second Amendment and, individual gun rights? There are states, on the one hand, the blue states, on the other, the red states, that might not sit still for that judgment and might not allow it to be enforced within their state. So nullification of that kind could also easily lead to a shooting civil war. We hope and pray, of course, that doesn't happen, but that will require some moderation on both sides, but primarily, I have to say, on the left side, because they are, I really think, in the driver's seat of the political revolution that we're talking about.
Yeah, so, all right. So since the book appeared in January and went on sale, as you know, you've been subject to a fairly vigorous attack by a mutual friend of ours, Shep Melnick at Boston College,
yes,
on the otherwise usually very fine Law Liberty site that the Liberty Fund runs. And So, I know you're going to write a longer response to him. We can't go through the whole argument. It's quite long, but I'll pick up a couple of pieces here. One is he starts out in a very flamboyant way, which is kind of ironic, I think, if you think about it, where he reminds people that you had written in the New York Post last summer, maybe we should call these the 1619 riots, all the riots going on around the country. Right. And Nicole Hannah-Jones tweeted briefly, "It would be my honor to have them called the 1619 riots," a tweet that disappeared. Just as an aside, I wonder how often the editors of the New York Times tell her that she needs to take down one of her intemperate tweets, because she does a lot of that. Put something crazy up and then taking it down. But anyway, Shep, in a rhetorical turn of phrase, says, well, maybe we should call the January 6 events at the Capitol the Flight 93 riots. He's trying to do a more moral equivalency between the riots and lawlessness of last summer, and also the attack on the founding by the 1619 Project and so forth, with, of course, Michael Anton's famous Flight 93 essay published online 4 years ago. So I'll sort of start there. Do you want to grab hold of that to slap back, or do you want to move on to some more serious aspects of the argument?
Well, no, that's I think his cleverest turn. And my response to it is quite simple. So to the proposition that the riots in Seattle and Portland and all over the country in 2020 were the 1619 riots, Nicole Hannah-Jones said, yes, you're right. I would be honored if you consider them to be the 1619 riots. What was my response to the riots on January 6th on the Capitol? Well, if you look I wrote a long piece about this in the Claremont Review, which Shep, didn't advert to at all. But if he read it, what did I say about it? That we must condemn these riots. Any conservative, any citizen, any constitutionalist has to condemn this interference with Congress and this violence on Capitol Hill and so forth. No doubt about it. I disclaimed any. I have had absolutely no support and expressed none for it. So I don't see the parallel that he sees in these events.
Yeah, I think, like I say, that's why I describe it as rhetorical. It's just too irresistible to pass up, which is, I don't know, a bit of a surprise for Shep, who's a pretty sober guy. So let's take one or two of his more serious criticisms, and that I think are weak. So he thinks you overstate the character of Wilsonian Hegelian progressivism. And in particular, I think of one paragraph where he says here, I'll just quote him here, it's hard to see how this state, meaning the Wilsonian state, run by expert civil servants, differs all that much from Hamilton's energetic executive. And then he goes on further and says that it's really hard to see our administrative state as being a full-blown Max Weberian style bureaucracy. Now, I think he's wrong on both of those counts, but I wonder what your response is.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see the difference between the Wilsonian executive and the energetic executive, the energetic constitutional executive, let's say, of Alexander Hamilton, except for the fact that the Wilson one is not energetic, not constitutionalist, and really not executive. I mean, the executive is really the agent of the state, the whole state. And that means not just of, the powers granted in Article 2 of the Constitution, but whatever the state needs, the power must be found for the executive to do. And if that means regulating the size of sewer pipes in St. Louis, if it means regulating the income of bakers in Minnesota, no matter how picayune or how localized the issue, the executive is competent to do that. And that is simply not the way Hamilton understood the executive function.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that quite aside from questioning whether the experts really have expertise,
Right.
this whole last year is a great case study in that. I think the other thing that he misses, and then we'll move on. We could do this for too long, and we'll wait your full reply. But the other thing he misses is something that Wilson and other progressives thought couldn't happen, which is the class of experts duly empowered and sealed off from political accountability would form an interest unto themselves,
Yes.
a faction unto themselves, right? And so what Shep does say something about how, he brings up John DiIulio and others and says, we ought to maybe give bureaucrats more power. I mean, DiIulio argues this very persuasively.
Yeah.
He thought it would both improve their performance and increase accountability. And I want to suggest a sentence to Shep, which is, well, maybe if you can fire them. And of course, right now we don't have that power. Right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, right. Let me talk about extend two defects on our side that are hinted at in your book, but I want to draw you out a little further.
Okay.
One is you note early on that if you go back to 30 years, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the enthusiasm for the end of history, meaning market-oriented liberal democracy as far as the eye could see. And you noted that it didn't actually end any of the internal assaults on constitutional government that had been overcoming the country for almost a century. Right. In other words, we conservatives, we libertarians, we were way too triumphant and thought we had the wind at our backs. And that looks to have been a contingent historical mistake. I think that's now pretty obvious. The second one is, you make some reference to this. If you go back 30, 40 years ago, conservatives, starting with Nixon, but especially with Reagan, said our remedy for these problems is to go back to constitutional originalism. And, that seemed like a sensible idea. We saw an out-of-control activist court during the Warren Court years and so forth. And who could be, from a conservative point of view, who could be against a return to originalism? And when I look out today, what I see is we have what I'm calling a Baskin-Robbins problem. We have 31 flavors of originalism now, and they're all very interesting and inventive. Often they disagree with each other. And quite aside from trying to parse out different species of originalism or what's our particular approach might be, I'm wondering if, that was also a mistake. And maybe one particular form of the question will be this, and I'll shut up, which is there's a lot of people who say we ought now to be in favor of, the euphemism conservatives use is judicial engagement, because we don't want to say judicial activism. But the point is, there are people openly arguing that we ought to have judicial activism from the right. So that was a whole lot to throw out at you. Pick whatever part of it you might like to run with. But is original constitutional jurisprudence, is that sufficient for us to reverse the problems that we're in?
That's a great panoply of things to think about. But I would say the short answer is no. The reason why there were, almost immediately upon the announcement of originalism, the debate began about what was the original intention of any provision of the Constitution. Is it simply the language of the text? Is it the text plus the history of, or the tradition of interpretation of the text? Is there room for natural law, or for, you might say, rational presumptions behind the text, above the text, beyond the text, that might inform our interpretation of the text? And these were all very impressive and unavoidable questions, really. And I think what it showed you was that the court on its own was not going to be able to decide those questions very briskly, and certainly not very, steadfastly. The court does follow the election returns in one way or another. And what we've seen is, even the most conservative justices, with few exceptions, bending to what they think the requirements of the political age are. And that's probably inevitable. I think it just shows you, if you can't hold the Congress and the presidency for an extended period, you can't really reshape the court. And no proclamation of a new interpretive philosophy is going to stick unless the political boundaries enforcing it, behind it, are sticking. And we haven't been able to do that. And one of the most interesting parts, you as a great scholar of Ronald Reagan's presidency, may have picked up on this, but one of the things I've found very interesting in studying Reagan, first of all, is how great he was, and how absolutely unbelievable it is that Republicans don't study him, don't read his speeches, don't figure out how and why he gave the speech the way he did, and try to learn and emulate that. They simply seem to have forgotten everything that Reagan painstakingly learned and taught in his entire life. And that is criminal, I think, really, the neglect of the greatest conservative statesman of the age. Now, the other thing, of course, is that he didn't succeed in all of the important conservative reforms that he wanted to succeed in. And so we have also the other part of the lesson to learn too. What didn't he succeed in doing, and why didn't he succeed in doing it? And that also is a great question for conservative statesmen today and historians and citizens to ponder. But they really aren't doing it. But when you do go back, and so I have a long chapter on Reagan in which I wrestle with his career and his speeches in particular. I find in a strange way he's a consensus populist. I mean, Trump is a populist too. Of course, Reagan said, "Make America great again," long before Donald Trump adopted it as his political slogan. Reagan says it in two big speeches: "Let's make America great again." And there's a kind of Mayflower Compact populism to him, that we really could start America over again if we just got together and sort of talked to each other and activated the native genius of self-government that's somewhere in the American people, in their in their hips, as Wilmore Kendall used to say. That didn't work for the reasons that he confessed in his farewell address. That he had not succeeded in institutionalizing a new patriotism. He had aroused a very new patriotic mood, and thank God he did. But he wasn't able to make it, as it were, the prevailing view of everyone, and especially the elites in the country. He wasn't able to, he said, institutionalize it. And we haven't institutionalized it since either. I mean, the 1776 Commission, appointed as one of the last acts of the Trump administration, abolished as one of the first acts of the Biden administration, was Trump's too late attempt to return to this basic problem, this fundamental problem that Reagan had identified in 1989. I guess, the year of his farewell address.
Yeah, boy, I share your frustration on that. I have this quadrennial experience of when the Republican field assembles to run for president, and almost the entire field falls all over themselves to declare themselves to be a Reagan Republican while giving no evidence that they've actually studied the man with any care at all. By the way, I think Trump's the one exception to that in 2016, which maybe people ought to take to mind. And I thought for a long time about writing. Sorry?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to connect this to what you'd said just before, in a way, the end of history hypothesis is still, I think, active, powerful in the minds of a lot of Republicans and Republican politicians. They don't think they need to study Reagan because he won. We won the Cold War. He touched off an enormous economic boom, which really lasted for one generation, maybe two generations in a certain way. So what's there? I mean, what do we need to learn from him? It worked. And that's just a very short-sighted way of understanding politics. It doesn't work that way. It's not inevitable. You can't count on it. And you have to repay greatness, it's the enormous energy and effort that goes into successes like that.
Yeah, I have for the longest time been wanting to write either a long article or maybe a short book on, but it's sort of a downer title, but Lessons of the Reagan Failures.
Yeah.
And in other words, to lay out that one of the reasons he didn't make more progress on some of his main objects was that the problem of modern government was more severe and more deeply dug in than we thought.
Right.
And a lot of parts to all that. Although I also have thought of a thought experiment, which is what, obviously that climactic decade of the Cold War absorbed a lot of Reagan's time and attention. And what if he'd been able to govern for 8 years without the Cold War problem front and center of so much of his time and energy and so forth? And who knows what he might have been able to accomplish, but that ought to be a spur to ambition to people now.
Yes.
We've got foreign problems, but we don't have the acute problem of an instant annihilation with the Soviet Union we had then. So it ought to be, you never want to say anything's easier in politics, but it ought to be a little more straightforward than it was then. A few idle thoughts about all that.
No, and as you well know, Reagan never had a Republican-controlled House of Representatives. I mean, he was up against Tip O'Neill. And by the way, Shep is the Tip O'Neill Professor of American Politics at Boston University. But nonetheless, he was up against Tip O'Neill every year of his presidency. And so there was a real limitation on what he could accomplish.
Yeah. We do have an audience question about, I'll rephrase it this way. There's 2 or 3 ways to ask us, which is what the public choice people call the rational ignorance of voters. The apathy of voters, the low information voters, as Rush Limbaugh liked to call them.
Right.
And I'm not quite sure. I mean, do you have some thoughts on, and maybe the Reagan example is how you do break through. You have to be much more determined and serious about your relentless communication to the marginal voters, the voters that only pay attention intermittently. But that does seem to be a big problem. And one reason why there's no stable majority is that too many voters simply can't make up their mind.
Well, and plus, I mean, one thing that political science has not really, I think, understood the consequences of. I mean, the size of the government itself. I mean, the government is able to rain benefits of various kinds, rights, money, opportunities on so many people for so many reasons, so much of the time, that the tinder you need to have dry and ready to be lit for a sort of political rebellion or a real political revolution is pretty wet most of the time. It doesn't light like it used to. And that's because the incentives of the voters are rather different. I mean, it used to be that the costs were focused and clear, that you were paying in taxes. And so you had, since the government couldn't do much for you as an individual citizen, but it could enact cost on you through the tax system, you were sensitive more to the cost of the government than to its largesse and what it could do. But increasingly, American voters are in the position of wanting something from government, needing something from government, and not caring about the cost, because the cost is shared by everybody, but the benefits are distributed constantly.
Yeah, your comment on the size of government, Reagan used to say, I think Reagan was the one who thought of this, that government can only do for you what it can do to you, right?
Yes.
But on that size question, it seems like there's a great opportunity here. I have for a while been wanting to conjure up some kind of quiz or contest to see, A, if any single human being could name every single federal agency and bureau, and B, how long it would take them to recite it. And I think both are a challenge. I'm going to guess an hour. And even that's just if you use the letters and acronyms and not the full names of the agencies. And I'll also bet it'd be very difficult for someone to master all those. I've heard it said that no one can name all the agencies of the federal government.
Yes, I would think it. I would think it impossible. Really, I mean, I'm not sure how long that list would be, but it would certainly be a long and convoluted one.
It's pretty long, and yeah, that's right. So we're almost out of time. We're wondering, hold up the crisis of the two constitutions again. Is there a last question or comment? I mean, I have a whole bunch of notes of things I didn't get to, but last question or comment, aside from the basic duty that, as I always say, you don't have to read the book, you just have to buy it. But beyond that, is there another takeaway that you want to leave us with?
Well, no, I think you've done a great job as the host here, and I don't want to intrude on your prerogatives.
Well, no, I don't.
But yes, I hope you read the book. I hope you buy the book. It's we're in a strange position because this revolution that we're talking about didn't happen all at once. It's a rolling revolution. It's taken place over almost 100 years now. And when we think of revolutions, we expect something sudden and violent like the French Revolution. This is not that kind of revolution, but it's a more insidious kind, and it's a more lasting kind. And it is, so far at least, impossible for Americans to reassert their constitutional rights of self-government in many ways, because there's another constitution between them and the original one that makes that very difficult, and not impossible, but difficult.
Well, as I always like to say, you can't win if you don't fight, and it's hard to fight if you don't know what you're fighting for and why. So with that, Charles, thanks for the book. Thanks for joining us today, and I will let you go. And thanks to our audience for tuning in. We'll be back with another webinar sometime soon. Watch your email boxes and PRI's website for further details. Bye-bye, everybody.
Yes, thanks to the audience, and thanks to you, Steve.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.